Hey everybody, it's Matt Erpelding from the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce, and we are very excited today to have four pundits to talk a little bit about this crazy primary election that has been converted to mail only. But before that, I just want to thank you for joining us, number one, and remind you that the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce is a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing businesses and our community in the Treasure Valley. And we are excited about this program because we know that the elections that happen in Boise are one thing, but the elections that happen across the state and the other legislative districts will also have an impact on our larger metro community's ability to accomplish things at the legislature. So with that, I'd love to bring in my guests here. And I'll start with introducing, first we've got former Representative Luke Malek, who he and I were elected at the same time together. So we came up through the legislature and we learned a lot about what to do and what not to do in the legislature. But he now has a law firm with multiple offices across the state called Smith and Malek. And so welcome, Luke.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We've also got Melissa Davlin, a longtime reporter, now with Idaho Public Television, but previously with the newspaper in Twin Falls, and very experienced political pundit, Rachel Spacek, who's been focused on elections in the Canyon area with the Idaho Press. And last but not least, Scott McIntosh, who is the editorial writer for the Idaho Statesman and has been heavily involved in endorsing candidates this year, which it's good to see the Statesman get back into the mix. They took a break from that for a while. But let's start with you, Melissa. Talk a little bit about how we got here. So this mail-in election is a big deal. It's complex, and how did we get to this point?
Absolutely. Back in mid to late March, when it became clear that this pandemic was going to hit Idaho and affect Idaho, Governor Brad Little started exploring options. When I interviewed him in late March, he said that delaying the primary was absolutely a possibility that was on the table. That following week, they consulted with the Secretary of State and attorneys and decided that the mail-in primary would be the best way to go after looking at Idaho code and everything. And so immediately, as you saw, the Secretary of State tried to get out information to all registered voters, putting out this campaign that said, you can vote by mail. This is the new timeline. You still have to request your ballot and register to vote by the traditional primary election date, which was May 19th this year. But the difference this time, of course, is we don't have results and we won't get them until June 2nd, 2 weeks after that primary. There have been a lot of hiccups throughout the last 5 weeks since that was 5 or 6 weeks since it was announced. I don't know, time has no meaning anymore. But since early April, when Secretary of State Lawrence Denny announced that this is how it would go, there have been a number of people this entire time who haven't been able to get their information in a smooth way that you would normally see if you had that face-to-face interaction. That kind of culminated on Tuesday night when there were people who had waited until the last minute to register to vote and get their ballot, which of course is perfectly within their rights. I have 100% been the person who goes down to my polling place at 7:45 p.m. before the polls close to get my ballot in at the last minute. And so this is no surprise that there would have been this rush on the last day and the last couple of hours before that shut down, right? The difference now is you can't tell if people were waiting in line before that cutoff at 8 p.m. local time. And so it's been a long journey. And now with the lawsuit filed on Wednesday morning to try and extend that for another week for voters, it still isn't quite over.
And Rachel, you've done some coverage that's been really interesting recently about how the Secretary of State is working with some local companies to ensure the security of this election. What's going on there, and what's your take?
Yeah, so we got word, I think Monday or Tuesday, that the Idaho Secretary of State's office would be partnering with a local Boise-based cybersecurity company called PlexTrack. And basically, it is kind of an all-encompassing way of tracking security issues and also allowing the county, each county, to report any security issues or compliance with anything from the Secretary of State's office in one platform. And so election security is something we've been hearing about for a number of years. And I asked specifically what kind of security concerns an absentee ballot election brings up, because we have heard from readers of the Idaho Press that are they double checking signatures or kind of some concerns about security with the mail-in ballots. And I've heard that the county clerks are triple checking signatures on the ballot with voter registration. So that's one thing. But this platform will just kind of allow the Secretary of State's office to speak directly to anyone in the county who's involved with election security to try to combat any security threats or any concerns. So I think it's probably, I guess we'll see how well it's gonna play out in the next week or so. But it seems like it's a precaution that they're taking that is new this year with this absentee ballot election.
Well, it's a great segue, because Idaho and Utah, for one reason or another, has been able to stay under the radar by moving to an all-male election. And meanwhile, there has been at the national level a lot of attacks, including some attacks from a Republican congressional candidate in CD1 on the safety and security of all-male elections. Luke, can you talk a little bit about how those two, both the national discourse and what's happening in Idaho, appear to be on a collision course?
Yeah, well, I think you've got separate issues there. Obviously, at the national level, everyone's looking at the presidential election and saying, what does a potentially increased voter turnout mean for the presidential election? And for those who've run campaigns before, turning out your voters is one side of the coin, and then disenfranchising the other side has always been the other side of that coin that's maybe less talked about. And so I think there's a real issue with Republicans who think that an increased voter turnout may mean that it's less likely that the president gets reelected. And then at the local level, there's probably not as much concern, particularly in places like Canyon County in northern Idaho, where you just don't have that diversity of the voters that are likely to turn out in a primary election, specifically since the primaries have been locked down. So you're really dealing with two competing agendas, or I guess dissimilar agendas when you're talking about local elections versus the federal elections.
You said lockdown, but I just want to clarify, you mean the partisanship that's been introduced into the primaries, not the COVID lockdown, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, I figured. Scott, I know you've written on a bunch of endorsements, but you've also written on the absentee aspect of this election. So why don't you kind of give your perspective on it and the things you've written on, and maybe talk a little bit about a couple of the federal races that you've all endorsed in?
Yeah, the Democrats have a couple of really strong candidates running for U.S. Senate to take on Jim Risch, who has announced that he is running for re-election, going for his third term. And he does not have an opponent in the primary. But on the Democratic side, Paulette Jordan and Jim Vandermoss are running for that that nomination on the Democratic side. And Paulette Jordan, of course, is a well-known name. She was a state legislator and a former candidate for Idaho governor. So she has a lot of name recognition. Jim Vandermoss is a very strong candidate. He interviewed with our board and interviewed very well, and is very knowledgeable on the issues, and has very detailed positions on a number of issues. Our editorial board did endorse Paulette Jordan. I will note that we issued our endorsement several weeks ago, and it was before her campaign manager resigned from the campaign, which is somewhat troubling. But nonetheless, we did endorse Paulette Jordan in the primary, thinking that she would have a better shot at unseating Jim Risch, which is a very steep hill to climb in Idaho. Jim Risch won the last election with 64% of the vote. He's a well-established Republican politician. So whoever wins that Democratic primary is going to have a tough hill to climb in the November election. In the House of Representatives, there are a couple of really strongly contested races. Representative Russ Fulcher, who is in his first term, Republican representative, is facing a challenge from Nicholas Jones, a Boise business owner. And we endorsed Russ Fulcher in that race. We just felt that Nick Jones did not have quite the background or knowledge or depth of understanding of some of the issues that Russ Fulcher has. So we endorsed Russ Fulcher in that. And on the Democratic side, there's a contested primary for that seat as well. Staniela Nikolova, University of Idaho law student, is running against Rudy Soto, who is a political newcomer, and they both did very well with our editorial board interviews. They are prepared with the issues and their knowledge of the issues, and have obviously done their homework. We did give the edge to Rudy Soto. He has some background in federal politics in Washington, D.C., and has already raised a sizable sum, which is going to be necessary again for unseating an incumbent Republican in the state of Idaho is going to be a very difficult challenge, and he's going to need every dollar he can get. So those were two of the big federal races, and that we did on the federal side.
Now, on the CD2, does Congressman Simpson have a viable, real challenger, or is he flying solo this time around?
Well, he does have a challenger, Kevin Rhodes, who is running to the right of Mike Simpson. Mike Simpson is again another, I would say, popular incumbent Republican. Kevin Rhodes is trying to out-Trump Mike Simpson, trying to win the Trump vote. And so it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see if that plays well. I'm not sure. We did not do interviews in that race, so we didn't endorse in that race. But I would think that Kevin Rhodes has a tough hill to climb against Simpson in the Republican primary.
Kevin Rhodes hasn't responded to requests for example, the Idaho Public Television candidate Q&As that we did. He initially responded and then went dark. So from what I understand, he just hasn't been actively campaigning at all and has been canceling interviews or just going dark completely. So I don't think that it's a serious challenge to Congressman Simpson.
Great. So what people don't realize is in a lot of parts of the state, the Republican primary is the election. In some cases, they won't have an opponent in the fall. And in other cases, if they have an opponent, it's a big uphill climb for Democrats to unseat some folks across the state. But Luke, maybe you could talk a little bit to how the impact of whether it's a North Idaho race or East Idaho race could impact the Treasure Valley in terms of policymaking.
Yeah, well, I think your point is spot on, Matt, which is the primary election is the election not just for Republicans, but in a lot of democratically or historically Democrat legislative districts as well. And so, but the relevancy of having a Republican majority like we do to policy can't be understated, and so it can't be overstated. You have a dynamic in the State House, and not a lot of people realize this, I don't think, dynamic in the State House that is driven by mainly Republican politics. And so who comes from around the state to join into the Republican caucus on both the House and the Senate creates its own dynamic that's different than the dynamic that you see as you're looking around the statewide elections and the campaign season we see now. When those legislators go into the State House, there's a level of politics that is interpersonal with those folks sitting in there, and particularly in the Republican caucus. So a strong personality from a rural area can have as much impact on policy as a strong personality from an urban area. And that really starts to have an impact on policy when you start looking at education policy or healthcare policy or any number of issues that you really see a divide between an urban and rural populace in the state of Idaho. So watching these races around the state, I think people in Boise need to realize that what happens over in eastern Idaho, what happens up in northern Idaho is going to have an impact on their lives as well.
Tell us a little bit about the open seat that is in District 3 and the open seat that's in District 2, your part-time neck of the woods. And do you have any predictions on those outcomes?
Yeah, the District 3 race is a really interesting race because what you have is you have a pretty conservative former county commissioner running against a very far right political activist, and he so those two I think are going to split a really conservative vote. And then you have a third candidate that's in there that really is still conservative, but more centrist than the other two, and that I think that's going to put him at a unique advantage when it comes to a really what's traditionally been a really conservative district. And so Peter Riggs, I think, has a pretty good shot there at beating what would usually be a really conservative district, and that's an open seat that we need to watch there in the Senate. And then in District 2, you have another open seat, and you have the former manager of Greyhound Park, which for those who follow the legislature know was a major legislative issue when it came to the horse racing initiative. That park drove a lot of those politics behind the horse racing, and then you have another conservative, actually someone who worked for Russ Fulcher as his regional director up there for a long time, running against each other, and so it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. District 2 is also additionally a very conservative district. That's where Vito Barbieri comes from, and so that'll be interesting to watch how that plays out.
And Melissa, the East Idaho races, I mean, what a lot of people I don't think understand is that a lot of the issues that Idaho Falls faces and that the city of Coeur d'Alene faces are not that much different from the issues that the city of Boise, Meridian, or Nampa face. They're talking about, increased congestion, differences in how they grow their city. And so you have a couple races in eastern Idaho that really could shape the trajectory of any future policies that could improve cities.
Absolutely. I think what's interesting is traditionally not traditionally, but in the last 15 years or so, a lot of these really hot Republican primaries have been in North Idaho. And while Luke certainly brought up a couple examples, there are also a number of uncontested races up there, including with some pretty controversial lawmakers like Heather Scott. She's unchallenged in this primary, but we are seeing a lot of challenges almost across the board in eastern Idaho. I'm especially keeping my eye on the Republican primaries in districts 34 and 35. And so that's the Rexburg area and that northeast kind of corner of the state. And every single one of those races has a competitive Republican primary. In District 34, which is Madison County, BYU, Idaho, they have all three of those have two Republican candidates, including a very competitive race between Ron Nate, former lawmaker who lost to Doug Ricks 2 years ago, and Britt Raybould, a new lawmaker who got into the legislature also 2 years ago. It's interesting that Ron Nate is challenging Britt Raybould, challenging her from the right, because that's not the seat that he originally lost. His seat that he lost to Doug Ricks is open, but he still chose to challenge Representative Raybould, who is a national leader in agriculture and is a leader, up and coming leader, I would say, in the legislature, very active on JFAC and carries a lot of weight for leadership. Ron Nate was kind of the intellectual lead of the Idaho Republican Party Liberty Caucus within the legislature. So very high profile lawmaker who had been trying to get into the legislature, succeeded in defeating a more moderate Republican back in 2014, and then had a number of competitive primaries until he lost 2 years ago. So I'm very curious how that's going to turn out, especially with the mail-in primary. That district by far, Madison County especially, has the lowest voter turnout and consistently has the lowest voter turnout in the state. How is that dynamic going to be affected by the mail-in ballots, and with a lot of the BYU Idaho students going home for the semester now that campus has been closed? In 35, we have another slate of more conservative candidates who are challenging the more, I would say, moderate Republicans, including Carrie Hanks, who is another conservative Liberty Caucus lawmaker who lost in 2018, who's trying to make a comeback by challenging Representative Gerald Raymond. Rod Furness is facing a challenger from a Liberty candidate, as is Senator Van Burton-Shaw. And so, again, all of these races affect Boise. They're all interconnected. And we saw that, especially, I would say, this past year in debates over whether or not Boise City Council should be, those elections should be split up by area, by region in the city, as opposed to just having a free-for-all like it's traditionally been.
Now, the other one that's interesting is you've got the Donut Hole District in Idaho Falls, and
Yes.
Two-term Republican Brian Zollinger, who's being challenged from the center right as
Yes.
well. Representative Zollinger is a member of the Liberty Caucus and a leader in the Liberty Caucus. Does anybody have a feel for how that race is going to break down?
It's that's the other one that is just fascinating to me. I would say, especially after Representative Nate was defeated in 2018, Representative Zollinger really stepped into that leadership role, and you see him engage in really thoughtful debates on the House floor. But there have been a number of issues that have popped up in that primary, including the role of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Representative Zollinger is, I would say, an ally of the Freedom Foundation, works in a law firm with Brian Smith, who is active with the Freedom Foundation. And that, as much as some of the actual policy issues, has been a campaign issue in that primary. It's definitely interesting. And again, I can't predict anything with the voter turnout. that county received 3 times as many ballot requests as they saw in the 2018 primary, according to Nate Brown at the Post-Register.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, we still don't know how many of those ballots are going to be returned ultimately, but this wave of turnout, the wave of requests rather, could really shape the dynamic in ways that we just can't predict.
Rachel, swinging back from all of East Idaho coming into the Western corridor, there is a question here that maybe we can start with and then talk a little bit about the districts in your neck of the woods. But one of the questions is, will the pandemic play into some of the candidates' positions, those who support the governor's orders and those who didn't? And District 11 is one of those places where it actually is playing out. And so maybe you could speak a little bit to District 11 and a little bit of its geographics, like where it is as well, too.
Of course, yeah. So I believe Representative Tammy Nichols was the only Idaho politician at one of the rallies against the stay-at-home shelter-in-place order that we saw in Boise at the Capitol. And she has been pretty outspoken about urging the state and the governor to open things up. And other than that, she's been in general a very conservative voice in the legislature. And she's challenged by someone who I think is pretty well known in Middleton, which is one of the cities that District 11 covers. And he is the chairman of the Middleton School Board. He is a businessman, and he's been pretty outspoken in property taxes. He wants to lower property taxes. He, of course, wants school districts to have a way of funding themselves. And he's in favor of a local option sales tax for local jurisdictions. And Tammy Nichols has been pretty outspoken about deregulation and pro-business. So I think that race is definitely going to be interesting. And like I mentioned, District 11 covers Middleton, a little bit of Caldwell, and goes into a little bit of Nampa as well. But both Tammy Nichols and Kirk Adams are from Middleton, and from conversations I've had with them are pretty focused on that area as it faces growth and dealing with transportation issues and just growing, and they're trying to promote business in that area. So that's definitely an interesting race. And she has been pretty outspoken about opening things back up. And yeah, she's been one of the few who has been really outspoken on that issue.
And Luke and I know this, having both served in the legislature, but one of the things that we are really careful about, especially during the legislative session, is not accepting contributions during the legislative session. It's kind of something that you do because of making sure that you don't have any appearance of impropriety or any of those things. And she kind of got into a little bit of hot water this year after taking a contribution from Brian Smith in Idaho Falls during the session, and then having to vote on a bill that was very important to him. Can you provide some insight into that? Is anybody familiar with that issue?
Well,
wow.
I will note that, yeah.
Sorry.
It's not a legal prohibition. It's more of a decorum, like you said. It's the appearance of impropriety of taking cash while you're actively voting on issues, and not uncommon in Congress, for example, where you're raising money 365 days a year. But in the legislature, there's just this issue of decorum. So, probably harmful more than anything with her colleagues than anything else. And if her opponent can turn that into a campaign issue, then that's
yeah. So another area that historically has low voter turnout is District 10 in Caldwell. It's been an area that has been looked at for years as to why the district has such low voter turnout. There's a competitive primary there that is pretty eye-opening because it involves a well-respected incumbent, Rachel.
Yes, you're talking about Jerome Wagner.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So he is in a very interesting position. He was appointed to the legislature and then ran for Caldwell City Council and was elected. And this was all before or following him being city planner for Caldwell. So he's pretty well known in the Caldwell area, respected. He was elected in a pretty good margin to the city council, and he's being challenged by Julie Yamamoto, who has served a long time, I believe over 30 years in Canyon County as an educator. So a lot of her answers to our voter guide questions were supporting teachers, supporting rural education, and she is married, I believe, to Chris Yamamoto, who is the clerk in Canyon County. And he has been pretty outspoken about a number of county issues as they relate to state issues. So that is a pretty interesting race. Like I said, Jerome Wagner is pretty well known in Caldwell, respected in Caldwell. So we'll see if maybe him being so visible on the city council might lead to greater voter turnout and support for him.
The other one is incumbent and Senate chairperson Patty Ann Lodge. She's locked in another primary, with one of which is the same guy she's run against two other times, but there's a third person who's entered into this race. Both are running at her from the right. And both are part of that liberty movement or that Idaho Freedom Foundation movement. Scott, talk a little bit about how the Idaho Freedom Foundation has gotten itself involved in these races and how much influence they can have in the legislature by just picking up a few seats.
Yeah, so the Idaho Freedom Foundation does their rating system where they rate individual legislators on how they voted on certain bills based on the scores that they give them. It's a little bit of a a system that they have to grade legislation and then grade legislators. And certainly Scott Brock and Zach Brooks are running both to the right of Patty Ann Lodge, and Patty Ann Lodge, is certainly conservative, but at times has shown a more moderate side as well. And Zach Brooks really hammered her last time around in the last election and lost to Patty Ann Lodge, who is by most accounts a pretty popular legislator in her district. And so it's interesting that you have Zach Brooks and Scott Brock and Zach Brooks running at the same time. I suspect that they will split that vote, that number of votes that they have for that type of political philosophy is limited, and will probably get split, and Patty Ann Lodge will probably escape with another victory out of the primary.
Now, before we go to the Boise races, which a lot of people have questions on, there is one thing that has resulted in, I think, a lawsuit, and that's stemming from an out-of-state PAC that is spending heavily in eastern Idaho and not really disclosing their money and where they've gotten their money. Does anybody have any insight into that and where that attempt to get that PAC to disclose its money is at?
No specific insight on that. It's one of a number of examples over the years of trying to get PACs to disclose their donors and the shuffling that we see between PACs to try to, quite frankly, make it much harder to find who is contributing. And I wanted to acknowledge the spending in those East Idaho races, as you popped up that comment on the screen about that, the spending specifically in East Idaho. In District 34, $51,000 for that legislative seat B, that Britt Raybould, Ron Nate race. I mean, for a Republican primary race, that's an insane amount of spending. That's a lot. It's a lot of money, and that's consistent across the board in a lot of those competitive East Idaho races. And so, between how high profile those are, between the issues with trying to figure out where this money from the PACs is coming from, we're going to be hearing a lot more about that in coming weeks, I'm positive. And even though we don't have insight right now as to where that money is coming from, it's going to be a topic of discussion.
Scott, the Boise centric races are largely Democratic primaries, and to Luke's point, they're Democratic primaries where the winner of the primary is likely going to be the next representative. And we've got competitive primaries in 16, 17, and 19 this year. Let's start with District 16 and kind of give us where the Statesman landed and why.
Sure. So I will point out, though, that a lot of these races do have Republican candidates who will be facing the Democratic victor in the November election. So District 16 has one contested Democratic primary for state representative position B, and this is Rob Mason's seat, and he is not running for re-election. And so Colin Nash and Jeff Stevenson are the candidates for this seat. And I will say, in general, what we found when we were interviewing the candidates, just like the Republicans have kind of these two factions of more moderate and more conservative factions, the Democrats have definitely a split along more moderate and more progressive, more liberal candidates. And we definitely saw that with Colin Nash and Jeff Stevenson. And one of the common denominators is legalization of marijuana. And that is one of Jeff Stevenson's big positions. And that's what we saw with a lot of more progressive Democratic candidates, is a call to legalize marijuana, whether it's recreational or medical, or at least decriminalization. Colin Nash seemed to be a little more prepared in terms of knowing what his role would be as a Democratic legislator. Matt, as you are well aware of being in that position, you have limits on what you can accomplish and what your effective role will be. And I think Colin definitely demonstrated a knowledge about what he can get accomplished realistically as a Democratic legislator. Now, that said, he still, wants to increase education funding and wants to work on criminal justice reform. And so he definitely brings to the table those standard platform issues of the Democratic Party. And I, with regard to some of these more progressive issues like legalization of marijuana, a lot of the candidates, the more moderate candidates that we talked to, they didn't say that they necessarily disagreed with that. It's just that they're not going to go to the Capitol, to the State House, with that agenda in mind, recognizing that it probably isn't going to go anywhere. So that's kind of where we are with District 16, that Colin Nash has all the earmarks of a very effective Democratic state legislator.
And moving into District 17, which is an interesting one for the general. And the reason I find it interesting for the general is you're exactly right. It is historically a Democratic district. But if Boise State has some difficulty bringing students back into housing, that represents a precinct that has always gone very strongly for Democrats. And so that district, just by the nature of some changing demographics caused by COVID, in the event that was to happen, could actually become a dangerous district for the Democrats. But talk a little bit about the Democratic primary.
Yeah. So, and again, in this district, there are 3 Republicans who are running for Senate, state representative position A and representative position B. So we will have contests in the November election for all 3 of these seats. But for the primary, the state senator, so Mary Ann Jordan, state senator, Democratic state senator, she did not run for re-election this year. And so we have 2 candidates, Ali Raby and Adriel Martinez, both running. And again, we see the kind of the same split. Ali Raby is perhaps a little more of a moderate, pragmatic candidate, where Adriel Martinez is more of a progressive. And Adriel Martinez, who has run before for Boise City Council and Boise Mayor, definitely has more of a Boise City focus to his campaign. And we felt, as an editorial board, that he probably should continue running for a city office, whereas Ali Raby demonstrated a little more of a broader knowledge of the legislative issues. Ali Raby is a Middleton High School graduate, College of Idaho graduate, and she is now the executive director of the Jesse Tree, which is working on homelessness prevention issues through rent assistance. So she's struck us as being a very valid candidate and probably a likely effective legislator on the Democratic side.
And before we go to my favorite district, District 19, which has a competitive primary, I wanted to go back to Rachel real quick. Rachel, the other district that is kind of a disappointment is the retirement of Representative Anders in District 13. You had another state rep who was elected the same year that Luke and I were, who retired. And in that race, we didn't even end up with a primary. So it's essentially one person is picking the seat. Do you have any insight into what happened there, or what the story is?
So I don't know why Bruce Skog, former city council member in Nampa, is the only candidate running for that open seat. I also find that a little odd because, typically when there's an open seat, you see a few challengers, just like how we have in District 13, Representative Collins is not seeking re-election, and you have a number, over 5 people running for that seat. But I have no insight into why Bruce Skog is the only person running. I know he was a pretty conservative voice on the Nampa City Council, which in and of itself is a pretty conservative body. And he announced his plans to run kind of early on and not seek re-election for on the city council, but definitely an interesting situation we have there too.
And it's a really big change. Representative Collins was a longtime chairman of Rev and Tax. I sat on that committee with him for 7 years. And with him retiring, you've got a wide open race over there. Any insight into that race?
I don't have so much insight into that race. I believe we only had 4 or 5 of those candidates respond to our questionnaire, but a lot of them are local Nampa business people. Again, property tax, growth paying for itself are among the issues that everyone in that race is talking about. So it should be pretty interesting to see who emerges from that. Of note, I think we have some who sit on the Nampa Chamber of Commerce. We have Kenny Wharton, who sits on that board. And other than that, we have a district, Southwest District Health Collaborative person, Kim B. Keller. But other than that, a lot of business people, pro-business, pro-property tax relief in that race.
Anybody who's on the chamber. I mean, we don't make endorsements here at the chamber, but no. We've got one more race that's actually in western Ada County, kind of on the Ada County border. It's a seat that was originally in the last cycle held by former Representative Tom Daly, who left to be part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture or Farm Service, and then was appointed to Representative Kiska. She served one session and then kind of at the last minute withdrew. And I know the Statesman made an endorsement there. So Scott, what is your take on that district?
Well, there's no Democratic candidate for this seat, which is, I guess, a little bit surprising. This is a fast-growing district and might be turning purple, and so for there not to be any Democratic candidates is a bit surprising. And so we have three Republican candidates: Greg Furch, Eli Hodson, and Brenda Palmer. They will face a Libertarian candidate, Lisa Adams, who is on the ballot for November. But for now, we've got those three candidates. Brenda Palmer did not participate in our interview, so we don't know much about her. Eli Hodson is very energetic and passionate about politics. He worked with Jim Risch in the past. He said he serves on the Ada County Republican committee as the Keep Ada Red committee member. There's been some question about whether he's even registered, though, with the Republican Party. He says there's some sort of mix-up, but that's a question that is unanswered at this point. Greg Furch has been a long-time Republican precinct committeeman and past chairman of the Ada County Republican Party. He's worked with Tom Daly in the past. We found him to be the most well-prepared. He's definitely very conservative. And if, the past trends continue and the Republican Party primary determines the person who holds the seat, then this seat will stay Republican, and it will be a pretty conservative voice from what we could tell from Greg Furch's candidacy. He's a chiropractor. He talks best when he's talking about real life experiences about how legislation affects business owners. He talked a lot about getting rid of personal property taxes. So he does have some real world specific experiences that he'll bring to the legislature.
And, District 19, my former district and the place where actually several of us live, it has a competitive primary. And I just wanted to point out that the absentee ballots just in District 19, there have been, as of Monday, so before the deadline, there were nearly 9,500 ballots requested, but 5,000 plus of them were still out. But I want to point out that in the 2012 competitive primary and in the 2014 competitive primary, we were eking up close to 5,000 total votes. And so even if 30% of the remaining ballots come back, we're going to see in District 19 likely very high voter turnout. And so I know that the Statesman, you spoke to this. What are your thoughts on District 19?
So this all kind of goes back to Senator Cherie Buckner-Webb, who did not run for re-election. She wrapped up her fourth term and is retiring from the legislature. And so Melissa Wintrow, who is the state representative for position B, decided to run for that state Senate seat. So that opened up position B. So we did get three candidates on the Democratic side: Jeff Gabika, Chris Mathias, and Charlene Taylor. Charlene Taylor has since said that she is no longer running. However, her name is still on the ballot because she did not withdraw in time to have her name removed from the ballot. So it's really between Jeff Gabika and Chris Mathias. Again, we have that kind of split, the more moderate with Chris Mathias and the more progressive with Jeff Gabika. Jeff Gabika talks about legalizing marijuana, legalizing sex workers, and taxing sex workers. Chris Mathias, again, he told us that he doesn't necessarily disagree with these positions. It's just not something that he feels that he needs to go to the State House to focus on, that he'd rather focus on criminal justice reform and education funding. He has a very impressive background, a veteran of the Coast Guard. He attended Boise State University, where he's student body president. He earned his law degree and spent 3 years as the chief academic officer for the Idaho State Board of Education. And he has also substituted previously in the Idaho legislature. So Chris Mathias was a very impressive candidate for our board, and he got our endorsement. But Jeff Kubika is a very strong candidate as well, and it brings some of these ideas and these issues. I think the more people talk about marijuana legalization, I think it's going to be an issue that we're not going to be able to ignore for very long. So it's a very good, healthy, robust process this year.
Yeah, it's great to see a primary, and I hope the voter turnout in all of the districts is high, although, there's a couple challenges there. And before we sign off, the one is, you would think that an election like this would be leaning toward the incumbent. And the reason for that is it's very difficult in this type of an environment for the challenging candidates to actually connect with voters in a way that's meaningful and helps them remember their name. Does anybody have any idea of if that's probably the case, or if I'm just spitballing?
I think it's going to be so difficult to prognosticate on anything in regards to how this turnout. But we don't even know how many ballots are going to be returned at the end of the day. I think it's a good indication that people requested them in the first place, so at least they've taken that proactive step. But at the end of the day, we don't know how this. I think we're going to be surprised in a lot of different ways. Stuff that probably will make sense in retrospect, but there's no way to predict how this is all going to play out.
And Melissa, you've been around a really long time watching the legislature. This year's a particularly big change in terms of the changing face of the legislature and the amount of institutional knowledge that's being lost by lawmakers. Give us your insight.
We're losing the longtime senator from District 23, Burt Brackett. He was a leader in transportation issues. We're losing Senator Brent Hill, the president pro tem, of course. And we are losing Senator Dean Mortimer, the chairman of the Education Committee. There are a number of other people who aren't running again. You mentioned Representative Robert Anderst, chairman of the Speaker's Ways and Means Committee. And so you have this dynamic where we see this every few years, right? It seems to always be kind of waves of losing longtime lawmakers. And that truly changes the face of the legislature and the issues that we see in front of these committees. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of long-time or high-profile incumbents who aren't seeing challenges at all. And I think we talked a lot about the challenge that we're seeing in District 19, for example, but Melissa Wintrow is unchallenged in that primary in the Senate, and that is a coveted spot. I mean, the Democratic senator from District 19 is arguably one of the highest profile and most powerful Democrats in the state. And the fact that no one else is running for that spot after she announced that she was going for it, I think is kind of a testament to her reputation. Same with Representative Lauren Necochea. She was appointed, of course, to your old seat, and she is not receiving a primary challenge either. Barbara Ehart in Eastern Idaho is not seeing a primary challenge, and she was at the center of a number of high-profile and controversial issues during the legislative session. And so the dynamics here are really, really interesting. Who's being challenged, who isn't, and the amount of institutional knowledge that we're losing from these retirements. And we didn't even get to Neil Anderson, Gary Collins, a lot of these guys who
Yeah,
are
Marianne
taking with them
Jordan,
years.
Buckner
Marianne
Webb,
Jordan,
half
of
of the
course.
Senate's Democratic leadership.
Right,
Two-thirds
right,
of the Democratic
exactly.
leadership. Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, we with Senators Buckner Webb and Jordan, we saw an all-female leadership team with the minority leader, Senator Michelle Stennett. And so that's a dynamic that's going to change too, because not only are you losing these well-respected leaders in the Senate Democratic caucus, but you're losing their institutional knowledge, but you're also losing those folks in the leadership position. And so the Senate leadership dynamic, how that shakes out after the general election, when the caucuses get together in December, that's going to change the dynamic too, because they get together and they decide who sits on the committees and who's the leaders of those committees. And so we'll get through the primary. We'll see how this all shakes out, and we'll get together again in November.
Okay, final question. Voter turnout, high or low for this election? How many ballots will actually make it back? Luke, you say high. Rachel, high.
I say high.
Scott says low.
I'm going to be the outlier. I'm going to say low. I bet you it comes out lower than usual.
What? You're being contrarian for no reason. No, that's nonsense, Scott. That's nonsense. It's gonna be higher. On Monday, we had 370,000 ballots requested, and that was before Tuesday. If even half of those make it to the county clerks and get processed in the next 2 weeks, this is going to be a totally different turnout than we normally see. I disagree with Scott.
Rachel, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say basically what Melissa just said. I just don't think you can predict a lower voter turnout with so many ballot requests, even if just a portion of them come back. So, sorry, Scott.
You gotta fill them out and mail it in. You gotta fill it out and mail it in.
Well, I want to, on behalf of the Boise Metro Chamber, well, first, Melissa, we love your multitasking. You're doing an incredible job. Way to stay on topic, too, while you were petting your dog, holding the baby, and talking about the changing face of the legislature. It was impressive.
I have my first grader sitting over here, too, by the way. It's a whole... He's been so good at being quiet, but this is the working parent situation right now. Am I right?
It is impressive.
Thank you.
Well, on behalf of the chamber, I want to thank all four of you very much. It's great to talk with you. I think that it's going to be an interesting election, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do this again in the fall. So thank you all, and thanks to everybody who's watching.